Welcome and thank you for listening to the Civic Space today with Southern Defenders. In this podcast, we explore the status of the civic and political space in the Southern Africa region. We unpack critical issues that shape the space. My name is Mandata Mloja and I'm your host. Today, I'm joined by Zenaida Machado, who's a senior researcher at Human Rights Watch, to reflect on the role of media in human rights promotion and protection. In discussing the interaction between mainstream and citizen journalism, in documenting human rights cases and violations, this episode seeks to also center journalists as human rights defenders and how their work contributes to how ordinary people and human rights defenders access human rights support. Zenaida's extensive experience in the media and human rights space makes her a valuable contributor to today's conversation. Zenaida, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
You're welcome. So we'd like to start the conversation by getting a sense of who you are. I know I've kind of given a hint to who you are and your journey, but in your own words, who is Zenaida Machado?
You said very well. I'm a journalist, 2 decades and more of journalism. But I've recently, as of 2015, started the work of researching on human rights abuses and advocating for fundamental changes on how essentially governments and other non-state players treat communities and how better they can work to improve human rights of the communities. What I do is not completely different from what journalists do. The biggest difference is that the job of a researcher is more in depth, so it's quite similar to that of an investigative journalist. And I think the extra element to my work is the fact that while journalists try to remain impartial, somebody who does my job is impartial for as long as is documenting facts, because it cannot assume things while documenting. But once the facts are established, with them kind of wear the T-shirt of advocates and activists, and our objective is to influence others to change the way things are running.
Thank you so much for this foundation. So when you're looking at the current media landscape in Southern Africa, particularly regarding its openness to covering human rights violations, how does it look and how does traditional media compare to digital platforms?
I think we can't really give a same picture for all Southern African countries. Despite countries in this part of the region having a similar course of history, especially political history, the way media has grown over the past decades of independence has varied from country to country. For example, you will see that countries like South Africa have a media landscape far much free and fair and diverse than, for example, a country like Angola. And you probably say it's because Angola has had for many decades a very closed regime. It was a very closed society. It tried to open up in the past, let's say, 5 years or 5 to 7 years with the death of the former president José Eduardo dos Santos and the coming of a new president. But it's also the South African environment is also different from that of Mozambique, where it didn't have as a close society as the one in Angola, but it has a ruling party in power that is very, very paranoid about controlling what the press said. Although the Mozambican press is more diverse than that of Angola, you still have a lot of influence of the government in what on how journalists do their job. Another case, for example, that is important to note is that of Zambia, for example. It doesn't have a the history of apartheid from like South Africa, but it was never a closed society like Angola. But it has managed to keep a media environment that is relatively healthier. Compare it, for example, to that of Angola, Mozambique, or probably Tanzania and Malawi. So you can't really say it's one case fits it all. It's a very diverse region. Every country has its own history, and the media has developed or regressed according to the progress they have made politically.
When you're looking at traditional media and the digital platforms that we have, how do those look today and how do they compare in terms of their coverage of human rights issues?
I think one thing that the digital media has done well was to provide young people, especially, or those that felt marginalized by the traditional media over decades, with a platform where they can have their voices heard. And when I say they felt marginalized, I'm talking about those countries where the regimes in place or the governments in place have over years controlled what the traditional media say, controlled by either appointing the management of those institutions or approving legislation that limits freedoms of the press, freedom of expression, or, for example, by limiting the number of independent media that can operate in the country. For example, we have cases like Angola, for example, where the state media clearly dominates the entire country, and there are very few, but very few independent media houses, and those that exist, and most of them, if not all of them, controlled by people that belong to the ruling party. So in countries like that, the digital platforms have allowed those who for many years did not see themselves in the traditional media, did not hear their voice, did not see their face or similar voice or similar faces, to have a platform on social media to say what they feel. For those countries where media has been allowed to operate freely and fairly, for example, like South Africa or Zambia, or Tanzania to some extent, it also the digital platforms provide a broader diversity of voices and opinions. People can freely say what they want to say without having to wait for a permission or license to speak in the so-called traditional platforms, or without having to follow an editorial guideline or an editorial agenda, for example. They can now broadcast in the way they wish. For example, for those who have that possibility, they can also tell the stories to their friends the way they would have wanted to hear the story, for example, from the traditional platforms. Of course, there are challenges in that, and we'll probably discuss them in the course of this conversation. But I think that's what the digital platforms brought, a space for people to challenge what the traditional media is saying, to freely express how they themselves feel or how they would want a certain story to be told, and to engage with others as well, because most times the traditional media houses are a bit of one says for others to hear, while the digital platform allows some sort of exchange of views. I say, you comment, and in that process, people have a more engaging and conversational way of telling a story.
You mentioned earlier that, you were a journalist for 20 years. Can you tell us a bit about that experience documenting human rights cases in Southern Africa, on the particular country that maybe you focused on, and the challenges you faced in this work?
I come from a history of journalism that is very strongly connected to big media houses, and with very traditional way of doing journalism, and in some cases not very flexible to external influence. For example, for many years I worked for Radio Mozambique, which is the public broadcaster in Mozambique, the biggest, the one that has the most, that has the widest reach. I mean, you can hear Radio Mozambique, or the channels of Radio Mozambique in different languages of Mozambique almost everywhere in the Mozambican territory. So is by far the biggest, the most important, the most powerful media group. And because of that, it also suffers from influence of those that feel that they have to dominate or control the narrative that comes out of Radio Mozambique. So I was privileged to work at Radio Mozambique when the company was more independent, and then when it moved to a more controlled space, to a point where even the chairperson appointment, for example, would require an avail from the ruling party. And then from Radio Mozambique, I moved to the BBC, a much bigger corporation, more diverse staff, covering the entire continent, with management more diverse, where you can get, for example, your editor being linked to the government of the day, but then you get your director of information who does not have that link at all. So and the whole structure of how independent we need to remain in our work comes from the time when we meet to discuss the stories of the day, the editorial meeting, because it's such a big table with so many diverse people, with so many diverse backgrounds, that all of those views have to be heard before we decide what is it that we are going to cover on that specific day and how we are going to cover it. And my experiences in those, and of course in between those, I had several occasions to work as a freelancer or as a correspondent freelancer to different media groups and agencies. And one thing I've learned in my job is that a lot of what you do depends on who you have to answer questions to, in terms of your structure in your workplace, who is your boss, how flexible your boss is. For example, I find covering human rights issues much easier when, for example, I had to do the job of a freelancer. Because usually the person who had commissioned me a story is somebody outside my country who heard about something and writes to me and asks, look, we have heard of this story, can you file? And then I'm more independent about my choices then, who I'm going to talk to, what kind of angle I'm going to pick, and how I will sell the story. Of course, the last decision on how to publish it, or if it's going to publish or not, it's from the editor of whatever publication I'm filing to. That flexibility I didn't get, for example, when I was working for Radio Mozambique. I mean, it's most of the stories I worked on was those that had already been chosen by the editor-in-chief, for example, or that had already been chosen or decided at the level of editors and the director of information. So we would arrive in the newsroom and be told, okay, this is what you are going to cover. And even if the human rights story was very strong, depending who the abuser or the source of the violation was, you would see your story being accepted or not. I mean, if the abuser was, for example, the government, the story would probably be censored and uh, and re-edited several times to make the government not look bad on it. Um, Moving forward, when I worked, for example, for the BBC, again, had more flexibility to do things for the reasons that I explained before. But the challenge them is to convince others on why that story is important, because the BBC is such a big platform with such limited space and time, especially for African matters, that one would need to convince not only your colleagues at the editorial table, but also your editor-in-chief, your director of information, on why is this story so important that it deserves airtime on the BBC. So these are the big difference on how uh, on how I covered human rights over the past 2 decades that I worked as a journalist.
Thank you so much. That was very extensive. And one of the things that I'm wondering about is whether journalists look at themselves as human rights defenders as they cover these human rights stories, or for most, it's getting the job done.
I'm going to answer this from my perspective. I think I have heard more of this word of human rights defenders or sentence or name or title in my current world as a human rights person. In my previous role as a journalist, I don't remember even hearing that. I wonder at times if it's a new denomination, or if it goes to your question about whether journalists feel they are human rights defenders. I think journalists believe that they have a role to play and they have power and the ability to play that role. And if that role is to expose human rights violations, then be it. It could be anything else. I don't necessarily think when they cover a story, they look at themselves as belonging to a special category of people that uplift human rights or anything similar. I think they look at themselves more as those that have power and the ability to hold governments accountable for their actions. In my world as a human rights researcher and having to deal with a lot of human rights defenders, I also find it a bit challenging sometimes to convince journalists to come on board and join networks of human rights defenders. It's usually most of them, these networks are mostly made of activists, researchers, and other people that are in the human lawyers, for example, advocates, people that have been working on human rights issues. Not many journalists are part of it, unfortunately, because I do think that journalists are human rights defenders. In the process of discovering an abuse, documenting it, covering it, and then exposing it through their media platforms, they are somehow defending human rights. And they deserve that status of human rights defenders, just like any activist or advocate or others that belong to it. I think the main challenge is to convince them that they are not just some sort of watchdogs that stay far behind, but they are part of the whole network of people who try to their best uh, uh, defend human rights.
And maybe when you're looking at Southern Africa, can you share a specific example of how media coverage, either traditional or digital, has made a difference in a human rights case?
Like I said, I mean, the trouble of many countries in Southern Africa, the traditional media in many countries of Southern Africa, is that they are highly influenced, but those who are often the main abusers. That's the state, the government, local authorities, people with money and power who are often also connected to the ruling party. These are the main human rights abuses in our region. Corporates in some cases, because some corporates also control media houses, not necessarily by appointing the editor or the human rights or the director of information, but for example, by putting their by sponsoring. I mean, by the amount of money they put on the radio station for publicity or for airtime to promote their own activities. I mean, that's another way of controlling traditional media houses. In that sense, I think traditional media houses feel limited in certain occasions. Feel limited on their decisions to what kind of human rights abuses to uncover or expose. Of course, like I said before, it really varies on the type of government that is in place. If it's one government that is more open, less sensitive to criticism, more respectful of human rights and diverse opinions and freedom of the press and freedom of expression, then probably journalists will be able to do their job in a more comfortable manner if they work for traditional media. The digital platforms have offered human rights defenders a whole new dimension on how to expose human rights. You don't necessarily need to wait for approval of your editor-in-chief or your director of information, number one. Number two, you don't necessarily have to wait for the news time. You don't have to wait for that specific program that reports on human rights. You don't have to wait for it to go through the whole pipeline of editing process before or your story is out. The digital world allows human rights defenders to see, get the facts, and expose the abuse. We can start a debate about whether it also not opens space for people to expose abuses without due diligence, without taking their time to investigate. Yes, it does. That's the risk. But every good thing has its bad side as well. So yeah, I think that's the biggest difference we have between the two platforms of media. I mean, if you want examples, you can see across the region, for example, in a country like Zimbabwe, a lot of the human rights abuses we have seen recently, especially post towards the election and after the elections, attacks on human rights defenders, attacks on activists, attack on politicians have not been covered by the traditional local media, but a lot over social media, because human rights defenders are putting those cases and with very detailed information. I mean, they share videos, they share photographies, they share details of time, space those abuses took place. The same case, for example, in Mozambique, look at the case of Cabo Delgado, where there's an insurgency taking place for almost 3 to 4 years. Cabo Delgado had been barred to, the authorities had barred journalists and researchers from visiting the area of conflict, and they were not able to go and independently monitor and document human rights abuses. A lot of what we were getting was thanks to the digital platforms. People on the ground who had the cell phone could record and send it to us and say, this is happening. I mean, even abuses by soldiers, we got information from soldiers themselves who did not agree with what their colleagues were doing and recorded and sent it to us. And we were able to make very strong cases against government and make some changes on the ground thanks to the digital platforms. And I think that's something we need to give the digital world credit for. It has allowed abuses to be exposed more, and it also gives abusers a warning that they will not be able to hide their abuses forever. And that even if they control the traditional media, if they control the editorial houses and they know what goes out in the newspapers, in the television, in the radio, it's going to be very, very difficult for them to do the same with social media platforms like Twitter or Facebook or TikTok, etc., or WhatsApp, for example.
As journalists and media houses go about reporting on human rights cases, what are some of the ways that they can protect themselves and their sources?
Number one, don't work alone. Always make sure that somebody else know what you're doing. A friend, an editor, a sponsor, a tutor, whoever that person is, make sure somebody else knows what you're doing, because if you are arrested, you are stopped in a checkpoint, if you are detained, if you are kidnapped, somebody will be able to raise the alarm. The second point is make sure you belong to networks of journalists in your region, outside your region, in your area of expertise, and exchange tips, exchange experiences with them. Make sure you share with them what you're doing, so that they know how to protect you when you are in trouble. Because sometimes that your friend that you told him or her about what you are doing also needs to know where to go to in case you are in trouble. And the third one is follow your instinct. Don't do what you know for sure it's going to put you into trouble. If you know it's too risky, it's probably safe to follow your instinct and not to take that risk. And to protect sources, I mean, it's the basic things that we learn at journalism school. Don't reveal the names of your sources unless it's to your editor for obvious reasons. share with your source your own tips on how to remain safe. Don't get too excited to write or publish a good story that you will forget about safety of your source. One thing I find that is very common, for example, in my work as a researcher, is that because I work for such a big and powerful organization, authorities will probably not come for me. They will allow me to do my job, document the facts, and leave the area. And then they will come and harass my source. So I often have to think in my security plan, but also think in the security plan of the people I'm going to speak to. How to make sure that I can interview them in safe places, how to ensure that their identity is protected, how to ensure that they don't suffer retaliation, harassment, detention for speaking with me. The last thing, but not least important, is to look for training, security training, attend security trainings, all type of security training, from how to protect your information online to, for example, how to protect yourself physically in hostile environments.
These are very, very useful recommendations. And I like that all of them center on this reminder that, the story is important, the case is important, but the people involved are also important, not just the sources, but yourself as the person in that space documenting that story. So thank you so much for those recommendations. So one of the other things I wanted to just piggyback into, because I think you spoke extensively about just how digital social media has come in to provide an alternative, a very useful alternative. So what are your thoughts, though, on the potential limitations of social media when documenting human rights violations?
The biggest threat these days is that, unfortunately, repressive governments are finding their way to shut down the internet. And we have seen in recent years more and more cases where, especially during election time, governments will just give orders to those who own the digital platforms to just shut down and don't allow people to communicate amongst themselves. That goes down to the point of who controls those platforms, right? In many of our cases, the telecommunications companies are owned or are managed by people who are strongly linked to the ruling party. So, for example, in an election where the ruling party is losing, they will probably not want the people to freely enjoy that moment by using platforms that they can control. The same applies to when they, for example, decide to do election fraud or commit other irregularities. I mean, they can shut down those platforms to ensure that people who have observed irregularities are not able to expose them to the outside world. So that's one risk. The second risk is the fidelity, the veracity, the authenticity of the information we find online. In a world where more and more people use misinformation and fake news to manipulate minds, the digital platform, unfortunately, is a very fertile ground for that to spread. Nobody can really control or the speed at which a fake news moves in the digital platform, unlike, for example, in the traditional media. So that's another risk. I mean, how and that's probably I should have mentioned also in how when you asked me on how journalists can ensure the safety for themselves and for their sources, that's probably also something they should take in consideration. Fake news, misinformation. They should be able to differentiate what is true from what is fake. They should be able to know what are the genuine and verified websites and accounts. Although in today's world, even people with verified accounts spread fake news. But it's good for a journalist that is covering human rights issues to be able to differentiate fake news from real news, and to be able to compare sources of information uh, to ensure that what is put out there is correct and is going to work to benefit communities rather than cause them harm. Um, the other risk is that the digital platform provides you with a whole new dimension of freedom of expression. You can say whatever you want whenever you want without censorship. And the danger there is other things that we have often seen also happening lately: bullying, you know, what we call cyberbullying, bullying, harassment, online harassment, sexism, um, uh, especially towards women. You and I you probably know what I'm talking about, that it's quite easy for somebody who doesn't agree with you on social media these days to come and say all type of offensive expressions. And as much as you can control at times through the settings who you hear and what you hear, at times some of those offensive words that others might consider their ability to express their point of view, in other words, their own freedom of expression, they end up offending who hears them. I have a very a sad story to share. For example, I have a very good friend who is a very good activist, powerful activist in Mozambique, uh, very outspoken, very critical to government, and a wonderful financial watchdog. That once said, for example, an MP writing to her on social media and saying, "I wish you were raped by 10 men." And in a country like Mozambique, where uh, the ruling party controls everything, and this MP who belong to the ruling party, nothing happened to the MP. So, but the activist was visibly traumatized for a long period of time. So that's another risk of the digital platform, is that people cross the boundaries of freedom of expression because there's nobody to control and to limit what they should say and not to say.
Thank you so much. That is a very, very sad story. And I think what's most sad is knowing that this is not just one story in this one country. There's so many stories in that one country, so many similar stories in the region.
Happen everywhere. Yeah.
And there are same stories like globally. And I think what makes me really feel sad is this fact that it's coming from a lawmaker, the people that people in society look at and actually value their voices as authority.
Yeah,
So
and that there was no accountability for
exactly.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one of the other things I wanted to ask is I think you've been touching a lot on what the traditional ways that journalism has looked or media has looked, and also how digital platforms have come in. with its own dimension. I think my question would be, do you see a lot of collaboration between traditional media and this digital platform? This is beyond just, let's say, a media house having social media platforms, but looking at the fact that you already mentioned citizens now have the power to produce stories and put them out there with obviously limited training on how do you see what is fake, how do you know what is right, and also how do you protect yourself, because they don't have the training that journalists have. So in what ways can we see traditional media, professional journalism collaborating with citizen journalism in order to effectively document human rights?
I think that collaboration is there. You even those that are trying to resist it, I think have understood that they will not be able to resist for too long. Otherwise, they will live in a world of dinosaurs of their own. And that's because the world is moving, and there's a new generation of young people out there that don't tolerate to listen only. It's a new generation that wants to listen and wants to be part of it. They don't just take orders. They want to question your orders, your instructions. There is a new generation that more and more spends their time on their cell. They don't listen to radio. They don't watch television. When they put on the TV, is to watch what they want. So they don't allow the traditional media to force them to follow a certain lineup in order to eventually find what they want to watch. And in a world where everybody needs to adjust and adapt, those that don't interact with social media will just disappear, and that's a fact. People might try to resist it. I mean, I personally think it's a waste of time. Now, the way it happens, really, it varies. It depends on how open the media environment is or not. For example, in a country like South Africa, I remember I lived in South Africa for a few years, and I found it amazing how in the morning you put on the radio on your car and you have all these talk shows, and the talk show begins like the presenter begins saying, "Oh, I saw this morning on Twitter," and then that becomes the subject of the entire 2 hour show. I mean, the same thing happened, for example, when I was living in London. I mean, that TV, presenters, radio presenters will just come up with some subject, even if the initiative of, the case of South Africa is one where the presenter starts the day with a subject that he or her found on social media. The case of London that I'm trying to give you is one where the presenter has his own topic, but he will still want to hear the views of the listeners. So he would definitely at one point say, "Oh, give us your views by going to my Twitter handle or my Facebook or my Instagram. So, or send me your pictures, send me your videos. Oh, were you there when this accident happened? Please send me what you have, So that interaction has to happen. And for that to happen, you need to use the digital platforms. In more closed spaces, for example, like Angola, I like giving an example of Angola because it's a country that I work on and I've worked on for many years. And for me, it's very exciting to see how it's evolving over the years. So, for example, in a country like Angola, especially radio stations, commercial radio stations, the presenters are more and more realizing that they cannot do a radio show, especially in the early hours in the morning and late afternoon, without engaging with their listeners. Because their listeners, who are their listeners? It's people who are driving, it's people who are on the public transport, is largely a urban youth community that is sometimes far ahead than the presenter himself. So they are in those places where things have happened, and presenters do feel the need to say, "Send us your views." wherever you are, tell us what is it that you are seeing, what is happening out there. So that engagement, that collaboration is there. In a more sophisticated manner, um, um, I think one today cannot assume it has told the whole story if it does not make the effort to hear different sources. Yes, you went out, you interviewed a few people. Could it be that the one you did not interview saw what others didn't? So the best way to find out is to put out a call out there and ask that person to send their views. And it could be somebody that is not interested in being interviewed, but is interested in sharing the evidence it has. And social media allows that. You can send your evidence via WhatsApp, you can send your evidence via email, you can send your evidence on Twitter, and that only makes your story stronger and more powerful.
I love this reflection so much. And I think one of the things that I take away from your closing statement was just the idea of a need to adapt because the world is moving and it's either you move with the world or you disappear into the
Yeah.
past. And I think recently, as I was writing a paper actually on how digital technology has changed news media and African audiences. And one of the cases I was trying to reflect on was the gold mafia that was done on Zimbabwe by Al Jazeera, for instance, and how even though Al Jazeera produced it and put it out there in its YouTube accounts and everything, the level of engagement and interaction on social media was insane around the issue. And at the time, it was more than just conversations online. It was when you get into the combi, people are talking about this is what people are saying on Twitter about this documentary by Al Jazeera. So I found it very interesting that even in the offline spaces, the primary reference was to the conversations on Twitter about
Mhm.
this documentary, not necessarily the documentary itself is something that they've already watched, but more of we saw conversations about it. So I love the fact that there was ways in which social media, in unpacking things that people are watching on YouTube, was cascading to the people that were not necessarily accessing YouTube. So I think you're very right to say there's a need to adapt by tapping into the benefits that come with all of these digital platforms. So, I mean, we could go on having this conversation because there's so much you're sharing from your personal journey, but also just your reflections from what you're saying in this space. And we could just go on. I love what you're sharing, and I hope that the listeners are also learning so much from you. But I want to just bring this conversation to an end and maybe ask you if you have any parting statements, anything you want to share as you close this conversation.
And not really, just to complement what you just said, but that is not just about how people are engaging out there about the story, but it's also about uh, uh, people authenticating your story. Because if you have exposed something through investigative journalism, uh, uh, it is good. It feels good. I mean, you feel vindicated as a reporter when you see other people backing your facts through their own evidence, and that feedback social media these days provides that feedback quite quickly. The story is out there, and you can quickly go on your Twitter and hear from others what they have to say about what you just said on television or on radio. And feedback has always been important in our work as journalists from the times way before I started doing radio. It was very important for media houses to get the feedback of their listeners, their viewers, their readers. But it took their own time because I mean you will only get. I remember the times when feedback could come in form of letters. Just think about it. I mean, we would have a show today and we'll only get the view of the listener, I mean, a week or 2 weeks after. And that is if the letter made it to you, because sometimes the letters will get lost somewhere at the reception or the box. Today it's much easier. I mean, while the show is ongoing, You can symbolize people to come on Twitter and tell you what they think about the show, what they think about the abuses you just uncovered. What do they think about how you handled the story itself? And that feedback that you get immediately will only help you as a journalist to improve your work.
Thank you so much, Zenaida, for your time and your reflection. This, again, like I said, was very powerful. It was very meaningful. And I know that the listeners as well got a lot of things. And I hope that they follow you in the different spaces to see the powerful work that you're doing.
Thank you.
And also just thank you to all our listeners. Would love to hear your feedback and thoughts on today's episode. Leave us a comment on the platform you're using to listen to this episode or take us on a post on social media. Remember to share this podcast and follow Southern Defenders on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or YouTube. You can visit our website, www.southerndefenders.africa, to get a broader sense of the work that we do. This is the Civic Space Today, a program of the Southern Defenders. I am Mandatim Loja, your host for today's episode. Thank you for tuning in and see you next time. Together, we defend.